Greetings mortals, I'm BATTLEMODE, and in this video I aim to show you the techniques I use to keep myself interested and invested in very big, complex and lengthy strategy games. This is a series of principles I've learned playing epic scale monsters like Shadow Empire, Dominions, John Tiller's wargames and the Total War series, amongst many others. I not only believe this approach will apply to pretty much any genre of video game that requires a significant time and energy investment, such as CRPGs, classic roguelikes and city builders, but that the principles here can be extrapolated out into other aspects of life. One of the most common complaints I see about strategy games, and 4X games in particular, is that the end game is boring. I think this is only partly true. 4X games are notoriously difficult to make, particularly in keeping everybody happy right the way through the game, and I suspect this is partly because the genre attracts such a wide variety of players who each like different parts of what a 4X offers. But honestly, usually what makes a 4X boring is it being a boring 4X game, or it not providing the tools to keep a player engaged. I strongly believe that following the advice in this guide will do much to mitigate the perceived issue with mid and late game boredom in long strategy games regardless of the genre. My initial reasoning for this line of thought was that some players, myself included, just don't see this issue as much as others seem to, and I've thought long and hard about why that might be. Now, this is all just one guy's semi-educated opinion, mixed with some input from the gaming community as a whole. There's nothing scientific in here, but I'm convinced that this will help at least some of you to enjoy your games more. When discussing individual games, this kind of talk can easily devolve into some form of the old, "you're just not playing it properly" argument, and that's rarely helpful. Instead, I present a general purpose approach to enjoying large, complex and lengthy games, and the best thing about this system is that it's really simple. I've picked 3 particularly difficult, complex and downright intimidating games to illustrate these points, with the intention that the viewer can scale and adapt these principles to their own chosen titles, and I must emphasise that you don't need to be playing such esoteric, difficult games to benefit from this video. This will work as much with Civilization as it does with Dominions. First off, know what you're getting yourself into. Is the game for you? This approach means you're going to be playing games a bit longer than you usually might, and so you don't want to be wasting your time playing something you're not going to enjoy. War games have a natural advantage here, as they usually cover a specific war or series of battles, and an interested player can consume all kinds of media to get them prepared to play. Sci-fi and fantasy games make more or less efforts to immerse players in some kind of fictional world. Some of these are very believable, and some are just generic or lack effort. With the latter, there's more work for the player to do here, I think. If a game has a manual, then go ahead and read it after the first playthrough or two. Yes, I know a lot of you will find this to be a chore, but there really is no better way to immerse yourself in a game than to learn about the mechanics and background fluff by reading. A good game manual will be interesting to read and keep the reader engaged with a mix of game lore, story, rules and hints and tips. Some games don't have such a good manual, and others are very large and difficult to read from end to end. In this case, read enough to get a taster, and then use it as a reference for issues as they crop up in the game. For games with no manual, you'd better hope the developer designed their game well enough that the player sticks around long enough to engage with the content they put in there. Now, this is a bit of a contentious opinion, but I'm going to say don't read spoilers or guides to that specific game until you've played it a few times. You're robbing yourself of the joy of learning. Not only this, you're also cheating yourself out of one of the key ways to bond with a game by struggling with it a bit and figuring it out yourself, and the subsequent satisfaction you get from achieving something you couldn't do before. This includes Let's Plays too. Yes, I know I'm shooting myself in the foot as a gamer who publishes a lot of LP content, but I'd avoid doing this until you've played a game yourself for a while. Most well-designed games should allow a player to understand how to be good at it through a combination of a good manual or tutorial, functional user interface, clear mechanics, and some trial and error. I personally love games with opaque and randomised mechanics to prevent excessive min-maxing and spoiling, but I know I'm in a minority here. But even so, if a game is a little difficult to understand, it needs to be engaging enough to allow repeated play for exploration. The worst games are opaque and uninteresting. Avoid these like the plague. If you generally prefer smaller maps, then start with those until you've learned how to get the most out of them, following the advice in this guide. I do believe these instructions will assist people in learning how to play much larger and complicated games and still enjoy them, but know your limits. If you're not sure you'll have time to finish a 1,000 star galaxy and remnants of the precursors, I'd probably just start with 100 and see how you go, and that's usually big enough. You can increase map size and game length settings as you get better at actually finishing your games. Often, you'll need to play a game through a few times before you know what settings to use. Hopefully the game's developer ensured that the default settings were the best ones for a beginner, but that's not always the case unfortunately. And it can be helpful to ask established players what settings might be good to start out with. Roguelike style permadeath and no save modes, often termed Iron Man as featured in the XCOM remake series by Firaxis, is an interesting choice. While this does encourage more careful gameplay, there's nothing quite like save scumming to help learn game mechanics thoroughly. I'd actually advise against Iron Man settings while learning games with particularly difficult gameplay, like the Tactical Combat in Age of Wonders series, or those with landmine-like gotchas that new players are unlikely to figure out before they walk on them. One example of this would be overloading your logistics system in Shadow Empire and watching all your people slowly starve. That said, Iron Man is usually the best way to enjoy a game once you've learned the mechanics, because decisions are meaningful, life or death meaningful, which is the main reason I think classic roguelike games like Rogue, ADOM or NetHack are so compelling to play. Now I like to say that playing strategy games is like cooking onions. You cannot cook onions slowly enough. The same goes with strategy gaming. Planning your strategy and then playing carefully and with attention is the key point of this video. I've noticed that my own attrition rate for campaigns is a lot higher when I rush through the game. The slower you play and the more time you invest, the more you'll get out of the experience. Not everybody has the time to play like this, and some games and their settings suit people with less spare time, but I'd still strongly advise against rushing through the game as fast as you can to see all the content or a victory screen. The journey is far more important than the destination, and if the campaign is getting dull, by all means drop it and start a new one, but you'll find that investing more time and energy into your game will increase the likelihood of you completing it. Plan your strategy and adjust it regularly as you go. Different games require different approaches here, but generally speaking, unless you're playing a game with a very limited set of winning moves, most games have some obvious victory condition and a variety of ways to approach and achieve that. Much of the fun in a strategy game comes from this planning, and there is much satisfaction to be had in seeing a well-formed and executed plan succeed. This might seem like a rather obvious point, but I'm sure we've all caught ourselves playing on autopilot, moving units, building up our cities, but really just playing in the here and now, and having only a vague idea of where all these moves are in the great scheme of things. Don't rush your turns. Unless the game is very simple or closer to a puzzle-oriented style of play, there's usually more than one right move and there's always something you can be thinking about. As I stated before, I hypothesise that rushing through a game is a prime factor in campaign abandonment and player attrition from a game in general. Developers put a lot of time and effort into making these games enjoyable, whether it's just wonderfully detailed graphics on the campaign map, as with the Total War Warhammer series, or the rich and entirely optional lore and story content you'll get in Illwinter's Dominions and Conquest of Elysium series. Take some time to absorb it all while you play, and enjoy what's going on there. You don't need to deliberately slow yourself down just for the sake of playing slow. Playing slower will usually mean you're paying more attention to the game, and attention is the secret ingredient here. But once you've learned the UI and mechanics well, you may well be flying along regardless. There's a difference between controlling the game fast and rushing through the game to the detriment of enjoyment. With big and complex games, manipulating the game quickly is usually a skill you'll develop as you go, but I just wanted to draw a distinction there. Take the time to learn the game mechanics and pay attention to what's happening as you're using them. For example, if you're playing a tactical combat game, bring up the combat resolutions detail screen to see what all those dice rolls are doing and experiment with it. Master of Magic is an example of a game where the combat looks quite simple on the surface, but there's some complexity under the hood that makes learning it quite challenging until you take the time to examine it closely. Another would be Conquest of Elysium, where the automated battles seem to leave the player with very little control until the combat mechanics are more carefully examined, at which point suddenly a world of wonderful complexity and depth unveils itself. To min-maxers and those obsessed with detail, this advice will sound painfully obvious, but not everybody plays like this, and I've observed that those kinds of players tend to complain about campaign attrition less than other types of gamers, and it's one of the reasons I started looking at this approach in the first place. I'd also advise turning off any automation settings until you're familiar with what the automated feature is doing and can do it manually. Examples include not using the automated workers in Civilization and turning off auto-exploration in Distant Worlds Universe, a game that was drastically better when the player learned to manually control it all until they knew what was going on, in my humble opinion. Do not use automated unit design features such as ship design in a Space 4X. Learn what it all does and do it yourself. If you don't enjoy ship design, at least spend the time learning what the ships are and how the automation is designing them and why. Playing a game too quickly is an issue that can particularly affect veteran players of a genre. Let's take 4X as an example. Sure, you've played the founding classics of the genre, Civilization, Master of Orion, Master of Magic, and many of their bastard children. Surely you know what all these numbers do by now, right? Well, that's not always true. The games do vary, and I think it can sometimes take stepping out into the weirder titles in a genre, such as with Dominions or Shadow Empire, to really pull a jaded gamer out of that kind of complacency. Those that are very different force the player out of bad habits, and those lessons learned there can be brought back into more familiar titles to allow the player to examine them with a fresher eye, and play them at a more steady pace conducive to closer engagement with those familiar mechanics. Let's look at an example of how strategic planning and carefully paced play can hold together a huge campaign. Here's a title that is very large, very long, and reasonably complex to boot. John Tiller's Modern Campaigns Career 85, a wargame set during a hypothetical invasion of the Republic of Korea, supported by the United States 8th Army and 1 Corps, by the forces of their northern communist neighbours. The enormous map models a large portion of both Korean countries, and both sides field an absolutely mind-boggling number of combat units at the start of the game, with more in reserve coming into play later. Facing off against one another across the famous demilitarised zone, with the North Koreans making the first move, the player is faced with a truly enormous challenge, and even by John Tiller's standards, this 150-turn campaign really throws the player in at the deep end with the amount of things they need to think about at the beginning of the war. Planning is essential, and as with most war games, some understanding of how the war played out in history is helpful when drawing up your own strategy. This game is a hypothetical scenario, but the developer very wisely included a fictional account of how that war would have played out, to give the game some structure, provide a plan for the AI to follow, and some guidance to the player too. With a beast of a game as large as this, slow and careful play is the key to remaining engaged, and the organisation and planning is part of the fun too. If you try to just move counters around in an effort to get the turns over with as soon as possible, you'll lose your connection with the game very quickly and be swamped by the sheer number of forces you're controlling. This is also a good way to lose. Instead, take a close look at all these units, see how they're organised into larger formations and try to figure out what their purpose is, using any documentation available to assist in this. Give each army, corps and division a mission to accomplish at the start of the game, and try to keep them together and operating in support of one another. Make plans for them, execute them as best as you can, and update them as the battle develops. Remember, these forces are designed to work in these organisational structures, not as individual units spread out over a front and placed wherever one is needed at will. Career 85, much like War in the East, is a game where the Republic of Korea player is initially surprised by overwhelming forces, and must play a fighting retreat to delay the North Koreans' advance. In the process, this will buy time for reinforcements to arrive and surviving groups to regroup and replenish. Right from the start, the player needs to come up with a plan of how to fall back in orderly fashion, find terrain that they can form a defensive line over, and do as much damage as they can to overextended communist forces. No plan survives contact with the enemy, and so the player is expected to update their plan as the battle progresses. In fact, a wise gamer is likely to study the starting position for several hours before they even touch a single unit counter. Strategic planning is not the only way to enjoy a game like this. We'll look at immersion in the next section, but to preempt that a little bit, let's look at how we can learn to love the soldiers we're fighting with, because otherwise, all those counters kind of look the same. Say the unit's name when you select them, and the name of their superordinate formation. This is the 3rd Brigade HQ of the 25th Republic of Korea Infantry Division, part of the 1 ROK Corps, and so on. You'll get to know the units and remember the tasks you've set for them, and start to care about them a little as they fight, take losses, make narrow escapes from desperate situations and achieve stunning victories against all odds. Furthermore, in a game this large and long, taking notes between play sessions is highly advised, and again, we'll come to that point later. Grognard wargamers are already used to this kind of crap, although I think Career 85 is a rather intense example of the genre, up there with Gary Grigsby's games for the campaign size and length, and I expect most of you watching this will be playing shorter, smaller games with a much more reasonable difficulty curve. But I think this careful, considered style of play, where the player spends a good amount of the playtime just thinking about strategy and tactica, will help keep people engaged in much smaller, more reasonably scaled games too. And I use this game to illustrate the fact that sometimes you can have fun hours before you even start to move any units. It's also worth noting that not every game supports such long-term strategic planning. Games with procedurally generated content, or many random events, often require the player to react more often, turn by turn. Still, in cases like these, it'll never hurt to slow things down a bit and take it all in properly. Strategy games should be deep and involving. Examine everything you have to play with: the game mechanics, the background story, lore and fluff, graphics, the music, Whatever the game has, use it. We've already looked at how we can do this with historical wargames, but how can we do the same with fantasy or sci-fi titles? If you've got a big imagination or you're the role-playing type, let your mind do the heavy lifting. Get to know the characters and situations and set yourself goals for them. Now, some games will have better hooks for role-playing and immersion than others. Distant Worlds and Stellaris have utterly forgettable characters, for example, while Shadow Empire and Crusader Kings are superb in this regard, and the more detail here, the better. If you're more mechanics focused and less into the imagination side of things, I'd advise spending some time examining how each game element interacts with one another. Min-maxers in particular are likely to enjoy getting to know the game mechanics intimately. Try to get a feel for what you're supposed to be doing with them and what possibilities come from their combination. Set and achieve goals. The goal of winning is often a little abstract and distant, and particularly in a very large and complex game, managing the many characters, armies, cities and systems can become overwhelming if we don't break things down into more manageable chunks. Humans usually gain satisfaction from achieving tasks, and for those that struggle, it can help to set smaller and more local goals as stepping stones towards reaching your endpoint. I think this is crucial to enjoying very large, long and sprawling games, as we saw with Career 85. Make use of any in-game tools to personalise gameplay. Renaming cities and characters to something that's more meaningful and memorable to you can help, and also get to know these guys too. Take the time to enjoy a hero's victory as he cuts down a difficult foe, and laugh as he dies in spectacularly hilarious fashion, a skill critical to enjoying games like Blood Bowl and Battle Brothers. You're more likely to form a connection with the game if you're rooting for your characters, and their every injury or eventual demise will cut like a knife. Some games are definitely better than others for making you care about what happens to your characters. One of the reasons the original UFO Enemy Unknown was such a memorable and well-loved game stemmed from a combination of a rather customisable sandblock style of gameplay, coupled with its brutal difficulty and casual disregard for the lives of your men. Soldiers could be renamed and given unofficial roles according to their statistics, or the player's casual whim, and this, and considering that they could die at a drop of a hat, meant that when your favourite commander died on Cydonia after surviving for many years in the war to defend Earth from a horrific alien invasion, and having personally guided him through mission after mission of gruelling combat, dodging shock bombs and chrysalids, you really felt something. Compare that to how you feel when you lose a leader in Stellaris, a game that is supposedly very good at immersion and role-playing but suffers from a weak system where your leaders really are just a bunch of modifiers and don't actually play a role in the gameplay. There's just no comparison between those two. Put simply, the more the player is immersed in the game, the more enjoyment they'll get, and the more likely they are to finish their campaign. If you only take one thing from this video, this is the main point, I think. I learned this one the hard way doing a long YouTube series on Shadow Empire. Taking notes about what you're doing, your short-term goals and where your head was at when you last finished playing will not only assist immersion, but if you do have to stop playing for any length of time, you're much more likely to be able to get back into the game where you left off. Even just using a descriptive save game title can be better than nothing, but with long strategy games, I highly advise keeping a text document to keep track of your thoughts. For those of you who are more industrious, writing after-action reports, AARs, or recording Let's Play series can also keep you engaged. This is part of the reason I record my games on YouTube. I'm way more likely to finish a game if I know somebody's going to be disappointed if I don't. I went through a phase of buying game after game, playing it a bit and then quickly moving on. Not only did this put a huge dent in my bank balance, but I found myself ever unsatisfied with the games I was playing. This can actually be quite a serious issue for people who have video games as their main hobby, and one way to break out of it is to pick a favourite game and play it over and over. More pertinently to this topic, repeated play develops skill in that particular game, and in similar games overall. I strongly suspect that constraining yourself to one game for a few months might actually make you a better gamer than flitting from one to another, and you'll experience satisfaction from getting good, because if you strip away all the games and the soccer balls and the juggling clubs and the playing cards, what you've got left is you. You're constantly improving your relationship with you and your ability to navigate your own talent stack, and I'm sure that you can see how that's a helpful thing overall. Now, let's go take a look at a couple of examples, using two particularly complex and famously difficult games to put all of this together. To illustrate the principle of immersion, I'll use a very large game of Shadow Empire I played over at Explorminate on YouTube. This was set on the largest map size, with over 160 AI factions to deal with. By the end, I was controlling more than 50 provinces spread out over 3 different strategic headquarters, with 112 characters to manage, more than 300 units of troops fighting over multiple fronts all at once. I think this is probably more than most strategy gamers will comfortably manage, and at that time I certainly would never have willingly picked up a game with this many counters to push around if I'd have known what I was getting myself in for. But, as Sun Tzu said, managing large and small numbers is simply a matter of division. Wargames will typically provide tools to allow the player to organise their forces accordingly, while 4X games are often less well developed here, but we can also apply this principle to our own attention too. The player's attention is a critical resource in any video game, and strategy games are no exception, and learning to organise your own playstyle is crucial to managing very large, long strategy game campaigns. In a game this big, it is critical to apply the principles stated before. Immersion, setting up a long-term strategy, and local goals, and then playing slowly enough to take it all in. We've already looked at planning and strategy with Career 85, so here with Shadow Empire, I want to examine how immersion in detail helps to draw the player deeper into the game. Take a look at your opponents. Who leads them? What are their traits? Who are they trading with? What are they trading? Who are they fighting? What do you think they're planning from what you can see of their situation? What plans do you have to defeat them if they invade? What are you going to do if those plans go wrong? Take the time to consider your options. One of the best features of wargame style strategy is that much of the gameplay is done in the player's head before they ever touch any of the counters on the board. Who are all these officers commanding your troops? What factions do they belong to? What are their skills and where are they best suited to be? What is their current military formation doing on the front they're assigned to? Are they supposed to be engaged in frontline fighting, or are they there to hold a pocket and await stronger forces to take their place for an assault? These are all important questions to be asking as you look around the map. Let's take a closer look at one of the 112 leaders we have in our nation. Here's Cyrus Underwood, commander of the 2nd Machine Gun Infantry Corps. He's 66 years old, started his career in the military, and he likes government and autocracy profile decisions, but he hates meritocracy. I've got him leading a corps-sized formation because he's well experienced as a general. Despite not being the quickest learner, he's an excellent leader of people and an excellent general. Cyrus served in our regime since the beginning of the game, and I've watched him grow old fighting for our nation. He's seen combat in a lot of Plains, Rocky, and oversaw the capture of at least 4 cities. He's the faction leader of the Reformist Union, a particularly troublesome group that caused me no end of problems throughout my game. Despite all of this, he's loyal and dependable, and I kind of started to care about what was essentially a bunch of numbers stored in a database. It's a bit weird. His 2nd Machine Gun Infantry Corps have a long and distinguished history. They were the 2nd professional military formation raised and have fought almost constantly from the start of the campaign right through to the finish. They're mostly made up of 3 different equipment model types, standard infantryman and 2 different types of machine gun. And I'm sure you get the idea. By paying attention to the fine details, I start to care about this particular military unit, just one of hundreds, because I've seen them fight, develop, struggle and grow during the course of the game. Many wargames will be dealing with real-life units that fought in historical battles, and so much of that work is done for you. But this principle can apply to Space 4X, fantasy games like Dominions or Endless Legend, and pretty much anything you can put your imagination to. Now let's take a look at the economic and industrial simulation. What are each of your cities doing? Is this one that requires the player to carefully manage each asset construction to work towards one of your industrial or economic goals? Or can we leave this one be and focus our attention elsewhere? We're in the middle of at least 3 wars, but is now a good time to redesign our road and rail systems to allow a smoother logistical flow? Which city would work as the centre of such a system? I guess I need to go look through them all and work it out, but because I'm invested in the game, this is a pleasure rather than a chore. In this particular series, before I'd actually record an episode, I'd often spend 30 minutes or more just going through my empire, asking these kinds of questions and formulating elaborate plans and goals for each of the elements in play. As I engaged with the various AI factions, with all the emotions I'd experienced as a consequence of our dealings, I started developing feelings towards them. Some of them really annoyed me, others made me laugh with odd decisions they'd take, goals and storylines started to write themselves, and eventually I didn't really notice I was putting any effort into immersing myself in such a huge and complex simulation. I was just doing it and enjoying it. Turns were taking me longer and longer, and so the game took a very long time to complete, but I didn't really notice and I was enjoying myself immensely. At other times, I'd play this strictly as a counter-pushing wargame and forget about the fine detail, and I didn't care so much about the immersion. I certainly played my turns a bit more carefully, but I think this illustrates that this approach isn't something you need to do all the time. But the more you put in, the more you get out, and once you're hooked, and you don't need to force it anymore. This was one of the most memorable times I've had playing a video game in almost 40 years of playing these bloody things. I remember previously looking at Gary Grigsby's excellent War in the East games and thinking, I'll never finish the main campaign there. And now I think I'd not only finish it, I'd enjoy it a hell of a lot too. I think Shadow Empire is a particularly interesting example because it provides the wargaming tools, such as an order of battle, more reports that you can possibly ever hope to read in a single turn, to be able to sustain interest in a huge campaign. This is despite the fact that it's also so complex that the player could essentially become lost even just a couple of dozen turns in. The minimalist graphics do aid player immersion, but it's the sheer detail of the simulation that ultimately keeps the player's attention. Much of it can be ignored, and while that kind of detail could potentially be off-putting, if you take the time to immerse yourself in it fully, you'll find it difficult to stop playing. Shadow Empire is complex in terms of the many interwoven systems in game mechanics, some of which are rather opaque and not immediately accessible to the player. Illwinter's Dominions 5 is a mechanically simpler game, but instead, the complexity lies in the sheer volume of content and its myriad interactions and outcomes. With a game like this, it's also critical to personalise everything you can, but storytelling and player imagination play a big role too, something that is well supported by the developer's fanatical devotion to weaving in their own deep, carefully researched and written lore. Now, Dominions 5 is primarily known for its large and vibrant multiplayer community, but here I'll be discussing single player, as multiplayer has its own way of keeping people playing to the end. Much like with Shadow Empire, by the end of a typical game, the player can be controlling 2 or 3 dozen provinces and hundreds of commanders with thousands of military units in play. The same principles for engagement apply here. Take the time to play the game carefully and slowly, get to know the characters in the game, and get into the weeds of the mechanics. Dominion's strength is in the incredibly large range of controllable game units and a seemingly unending number of spells, magic items, and locations to find in-game. The principle to keep the player interested here is the same, so I won't belabour the points already made. Rather, just show you how they're applied in Dominions, where knowledge of game mechanics and setting your own goals accordingly can be an effective strategy for both immersion and for creating memorable gameplay. In turn, this will aid you to finish a very large, complex, and potentially difficult game. One of Dominions' finest features is the variety of approaches you can take to finish a game. The possible permutations of build and strategy are endless, and I think to really appreciate this game, I'd encourage the player to pick a strategy to work towards and plan research goals accordingly. Whether this is out of a desire to beat a very difficult set of opponents, as you might in multiplayer, or whether you've decided to pick a particularly weird and horrific spell to end the game with, immersion in Dominions is done partly within the confines of this almost limitless sandbox of toys that you're presented with. There are spells that are rarely seen in competitive multiplayer games that could be very viable, fun, and thematic to use in single player. Let's take a look at one hypothetical scenario. With a little death magic access, you could build your entire game around the spells hidden in sand, hidden in snow, or hidden underneath, each of which summons some rather rare and exotic undead commanders and subordinate soldiers. Using these skeletal magic-wielding hordes to defend your empire from invaders, you could then cast Twice-Born on all your most important mages, which allows them to survive death. Meanwhile, you'll be working on researching your endgame weapon. Dominions has no technological victory that you might see hard-coded into a game like Civilization, but like Shadow Empire's ICBMs, it does have a series of doomsday spells that the player can cast that will effectively win them the game. In our example, your mages will unleash upon the world the dreaded Burden of Time, a horrific calamity that causes everybody in the entire world to rapidly age, causing severe unrest and ensuring that only the very long-lived and immortal beings, or those who are already dead, will survive for more than a couple of dozen turns. This won't necessarily be the easiest or most efficient way to complete your game, but it'll be really fun, especially if you enjoy the idea of your zombie hordes picking off pockets of elderly soldiers, old before their time, and the stories that this campaign will generate along the way will be the ones that you'll most likely remember much longer than if you'd just marched into your enemy's capital with a large army of magic-buffed spearmen. There's a caveat to this approach. Fantasy games are arguably easier to get into for some players, particularly in terms of immersion and role-playing, and Dominions is particularly easy as it is essentially a wargame with a heavy focus on leaders and their armies. Endless Legend and Fallen Enchantress legendary heroes both have a strong focus on characters too, with their own unique lore bolstering the player's own emergent narrative. This is not just limited to Fantasy 4X games. Master of Orion 2, the Endless Space series, and Interstellar Space Genesis are examples of this kind of gameplay in a Space 4X setting, while Old World and Crusader Kings feature a very strong character-focused approach to the historical 4X and grand strategy genres respectively. I think this kind of immersion approach is a much harder sell with less character-focused games, such as the original Master of Orion, where there really is no way to distinguish between the fleets you're controlling other than their composition and the number of component ships within them, and one of Master of Orion 2's better upgrades over the original was the addition of hero characters to give your fleets a bit of flavour. Also, while I slated Stellaris as having a terribly dull character system, the rest of the game is one big roleplay session, with loads of options to build your empire in a multitude of interesting ways that we really don't see in any other titles. As a quick aside, I'm tempted to argue that these more niche, old-looking games tend to work better with the imagination than do modern games with fancy 3D graphics, an argument we often see from the roguelike community when discussing ASCII graphics versus tile sets. I think Total War Warhammer 3 and the Age of Wonders series might be exceptions that break this, as these games not only boast stunning production values, but they also use those excellent graphics and sound to stir the player's imagination in a more direct way. But not everyone will agree, and I'm sure my view here is coloured by the fact that I've been gaming since about 1985, when all we had were crappy graphics and the best music around sounded like this. And so, your mileage may vary. The idea of playing your games a bit slower and more carefully might not sound like a particularly revolutionary idea, but I guarantee that if you do take some time to really get to know your favourite games and play them in a more careful and dedicated way, the chances of you seeing the victory screen of a very long campaign are going to improve a lot. I hope this video was helpful for people, and that it will start a discussion about how we can better enjoy our favourite hobby. See you later guys, take care.